Welcome everyone to TAMA Talks, brought to you by the Torrance Art Museum Advocates. I'm Janine Madden, current TAMA president, and I'd like to thank you for watching. Today's talk will feature the work currently on view at the museum from the exhibition UnCivil War and Elections Special in the main gallery. If you're planning a trip to Torrance, I highly recommend you take some time to stop in and see the show before it closes on December 10th. TAM hours are Tuesday through Saturday, 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Admission to the museum is free and donations are accepted and appreciated. You can find them on the web at www.torranceartmuseum.com. This discussion will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel with all of our previous TAMA talks. You can access it from our website, www.tamadvocates.com. The staff at the Torrance Art Museum summarizes UnCivil War as an exhibition that explores the events of January 6th, 2021 in Washington, D.C., which shocked the nation. The country has felt a divided space with a polarization and demonizing of opposition that has left many citizens in fear that a spark could ignite the fires of civil war. There has been a steady build in journalist articles reflecting upon the possibility of a second U.S. Civil War. Regardless of the realities of this, the fact remains that this concern is a part of the current zeitgeist. What will the midterm elections bring us? Increased enmity or a rejection of extremism? Will democracy win out, or will armed insurrection begin? Or will the status quo continue to stoke the embers of discontent? This exhibition is curated by MAX PRESNEILL, the Director and Curator at the Torrance Art Museum. UnCivil War features artists Lisa Ann Auerbach, Diana Sofia Estrada, Michelle Jacquis, Essie Miro, Jeremy J. Quinn, Dred Scott, Sandow Burke, Gaby Strong, Keith Walsh, Bruce Yanomoto, and Allison Stewart, who joins us today. Allison grew up in Houston, Texas, and currently lives in Los Angeles, California. She received her MFA in photography from Cal State Long Beach and her BFA in painting with a minor in art history from the University of Houston. Allison travels the United States exploring the construction of American identity through its relics, rituals, and mythologies. Her work focuses on the archetype of the hero and the effects war and guns have on our culture. Her work has been published and exhibited internationally and is included in the Rubel Family Collection, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the New Mexico History Museum Palace of the Governor's Photo Archive, and the University of Wisconsin Alumni Association, as well as private collections. Allison is a founding member of the Association of Hysteric Curators, which I hope we have some time to discuss today. Sounds so very intriguing. So I thank you very, very much for joining us today, Allison.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation. And thank you to Max Presneill for putting this incredible show together. I'm so happy to be a part of the dialogue.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and let you share your screen
Okay.
so that we can see your images and hear the stories behind them.
Okay. Thank you so much. All right. So this first slide is an installation view. So that's my work there on the left. I'm in the back gallery. I have 3 photographs and a video piece. And I'm so excited to have my work in conversation here with Sandow Burke on the right, and also the other amazing artists that are making such insightful work at this crazy time that we're living in. Um, so this is the work from UnCivil War is a documentary project, a social documentary project that I started in 2011, and it ended in 2015. It's called American Anthem. During the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, I began making work about the archetype of the hero and the effects that war and guns have on our culture. And so for this project, I photographed Civil War reenactments that were happening during the 150th sesquicentennial that occurred from 2011 to 2015. So I went to all of the major reenactments and documented the spectacle and the roles of the participants. There's a very specific stage at reenactments that give the viewer a very directed experience. And at the very first reenactment that I went to, I realized immediately that the tableaus that they were creating mimicked the Matthew Brady studio photographs that we are so familiar with from our history textbooks. So this diptych pairs my photograph from a Gettysburg reenactment in Moore Park, California in 2012 with the famous Civil War photograph, A Harvest of Death from 1863. The image was made by Timothy O'Sullivan and the print was made by Alexander Gardner. Both of them were working for the Matthew Brady Studios during the Civil War, documenting the Civil War. And, you know, that this war was really the first war to be photographed in its entirety. And, you know, most specifically the aftermath, because we didn't have cameras quite fast enough to catch any of the action. And so at that time, because it was so new, the role of the photojournalist didn't exist yet. And so all of the ethics and the rules regarding truth and documentation just weren't there yet. And so a lot of bodies were moved to make these photographs, and shots were arranged to create, you know, for aesthetic purposes. So a lot of the photographs that we know as historical documents were actually staged. But they still operate as historical documents. So I realized how strange it was that I was here documenting a reenactment of a reenactment, which serves as a document. And so it was that slippage that was really interesting to me. And so I started creating these diptychs that compare the original documents with the reenactments. The Brady Studio photographs were part of a public exhibition at the end of the war in 1865. And they were also published in a photo book by Alexander Gardner titled The Photographic Sketchbook of the Civil War. And the photos were displayed with the intent of them being used as anti-war propaganda. As you can see, the Gardner caption, he put captions throughout the book, and the captions were also on the wall at the 1865 exhibition. And so I included one of those here so you can see how they were specifically made and presented as anti-war propaganda. And these are, like I said before, these are the images that we know from our history textbooks. But we also know that the way that history is taught from state to state and the way these images are taught from state to state is entirely different. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the UDC, controlled which history books were taught in the South, and also what books the libraries were allowed to have. They were on school boards, and they used their power to create the lost cause narrative. That's led us to the division that we're experiencing today. And we see the same desire to control books and education happening today. We've seen a lot of that in the past year coming up to the midterm elections. I've been looking and watching those school board elections, and happy to report that that what's coming in is the people that were pro censorship or have not been gaining those positions. So I'm very happy that that's happening. So
I agree.
we don't run into this issue again. But we're still seeing so many attacks on teachers and school boards, and it's, you know, it's really reminiscent of what was happening in the Reconstruction era, and that's how the UDC, you know, when the UDC got started. The title of my project, American Anthem, is the title of the most widely used high school level American history book that's used in America today. And so the reenactors that I met all told me about how they learned how to dye and bloat from these images. And they recreate the document over and over again, romanticizing the role of the hero soldier and validating their version of history. And, this really creates a culture of that romanticizes revisionist history and keeps that mythic war alive. And these images that were, created as anti-war propaganda have become tools of the lost cause propaganda. While I was shooting in Georgia, because I was all over the country, it's amazing. There's reenactments everywhere. You would think that they're just in the South, or they're just, and they're not. There's so many in California. There's so many all over the place. I was really surprised. But when I was in Georgia, there were Sons of Confederacy that would show up in groups at the reenactments, and they wore patches that said "Occupied Georgia." And this was during, the Obama administration, but it wasn't just during that time. They really did believe that the Civil War wasn't over yet. They told me that, another fighting season was yet to come. So this discussion of, a second Civil War has always been on their minds, and that we've just been kind of living in a cold Civil War during this time for the past 150 years. So this is a photograph from the Gettysburg reenactment, which is the largest reenactment of all of them, and still is. It's still going on. But at this one, for the 150th, there was something like 40,000 reenactors. It was so amazing. I was just in shock of how large it was and how many reenactors there were. And when
This piece is in the TAM.
this piece is in the TAM.
It's
Yeah.
very evocative of Sandow's piece, or vice versa, right? They
Yes.
complement each other very well, considering this is
Thank
a
you.
photograph, right?
Yes, I
Yeah.
know. When I saw them together in that
Yes.
back gallery, I was like, oh, I love this conversation.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah, when I became aware of how many, reenactments there were, when I first started to become aware of this and start doing the research, my question was like, who is spending their weekends and all their money, because it's a very expensive hobby, dying for their country? Especially at that time, because it was during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And, if you wanted to go and die for your country, you could just go and enlist and fight for your country. So I'm like, who is doing this? And so while I was there, I would, talk to people, as many people as I could. And I never met a veteran who was a reenactor. I never met a veteran as a spectator. I never met a Black reenactor, but I did meet a lot of reenactors that were of age to serve. They just weren't. So,
Very poignant. Yeah.
yeah. So I put in a little warning, a content warning, because we don't see images of dead American soldiers. And, the Brady images, some of them are very, very, close up images. And so I just wanted to let people know that that's what's coming up. So this is another comparison piece. This diptych pairs a photo I made at the Fredericksburg reenactment with a graphic photo made by Gardner, either at Gettysburg or the fall of Vicksburg. It's from July 1862, I believe, and so they both were happening at that time. But by placing them together, you really, the spectacle of the reenactment is magnified, and the reenactor hero here, playing out this fantasy of the beautiful and glorious death, becomes kind of silly. And like I said, all the reenactors I met like to brag about how well they could bloat and play dead, and how they had studied these images, so they could create these really beautiful tableaus of the noble romantic death, which I found very, upsetting, when
Yeah.
so many,
It's disturbing. Yeah.
of our soldiers were losing their lives and were losing limbs. And, you know, I saw this as just really upsetting for me. My brother was a soldier, and so I've talked to him a lot about it, and he was like, I don't know what they're doing, you know, who would do that, you know. It's kind of a violation, he believed. So the next one is my video. This is a still, and so we're gonna watch the video. I don't do a lot of video work, so I'm really excited to have this piece in the show. So we'll go to the video now.
Give it up, ladies and gentlemen, for our fantastic reenactors. Come on, let's hear it for them. They give so generously of their time, their effort, and their energy. Yeah, anyway. Thank you, each and every one of you fantastic reenactors. Just want to let you know, you witnessed the third day at Gettysburg, Custer versus Stewart, as well as Pickett's charge. And in just 1 minute, President Lincoln will be here to present the Gettysburg Address. So spin around, come over here, take a look at the main stage. Immediately, we'll have a medical demonstration. There'll be a band concert, as well as the third engagement coming your way this evening, our Twilight Battle.
I'm surprised he didn't remind them that they could get cotton candy at the concession stand.
I know, right?
Yeah, it's difficult to listen to, actually.
Yeah, it really, you know, this is what they do at every reenactment. After the battle, they play taps, there's this moment of silence, and then the guy comes on and starts telling you about what's happening next. And so yeah, it does go from like taps to cotton candy.
Yeah.
It's really bizarre. It's very strange. So it really encapsulates the kind of spectacle of these events.
And
And you
particularly
know,
the
but it
playing of
wasn't.
taps is very evocative because on any military base, we've lived on many, and every military base ends the night with playing of taps.
Mhm.
So in my brain, that's what it's military funerals and
Yeah.
nighttime. And so it's really hard to see it in this context when it's really taken out of context significantly.
Yes, definitely, and being used for entertainment
Right.
in that way rather than the seriousness that it should be attended to. Absolutely. Yeah. I you know, the when the Civil War first started, people did go out though. It was kind of a spectacle because people would go out and picnic kind of close to the battlefields, not close enough that they could be hurt by them because of the range of the weapons was not, you know, anything close to, you know, what we have now or even in World War One. But they would go out and picnic, and it was, you know, but I don't think that lasted, you know, for very long, for obvious reasons. Okay, so that's the video piece. And, you know, that piece really encapsulates the kind of spectacle of these events, you know, the way that they use taps, and you go directly from taps to claps, and, you know, this talk almost to cotton candy. It's just such a strange experience. And this is how every reenactment works. They have the reenactment, the battle, and then there's this moment of silence for taps, and then it's on to the next thing, you know.
Wow.
So yeah, so that is the reenactments aren't as common as they used to be. There was a lot of them, you know, kind of during that time leading up to well, during Obama's presidency, but prior to that as well. But after Charlottesville in 2017, they stopped almost entirely. The Gettysburg one still is yearly, but the smaller ones have stopped. And then, you know, COVID was also kind of a death knell for them. And so, like, this one is from Moore Park, California, and this event happened every year, and they don't do it anymore. So they're not out there as much as they used to be. So so that's the work in the show. Now I'm going to show a few images of work that led up to this project and then what happened after this project. So this is an image from my project called The Fallen. It was made before American Anthem in 2009 to 2011, again, during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And so in this body of work, I'm thinking about the way that the American soldier has become a sacred secular Christ figure in America. And I'm photographing young men who have just turned 18 and have signed up for selective service. And so they are dressed in the uniforms of all the major wars and conflicts the United States has been involved in. And I had them perform The Beautiful Death. This image is of a fallen soldier of the Vietnam War. The previous one was from the Iraq War. I should say Vietnam conflict, since the US never actually declared war. You know, a lot of people still believe that just because we're in America, we don't experience censorship, but that's absolutely not true. Americans are not allowed to see graphic images of dead soldiers. And Vietnam was the only war in the 20th century that wasn't censored, and that lack of censorship created the largest anti-war movement that this country has ever seen. So while I was working on this project, and it was during the wars, I Googled dead American soldier 3 times a day to see what images would come through. And very occasionally a graphic image of a dead soldier would show up, but within 24 hours it would be scrubbed from the internet. The only images that you would ever see would be the images of caskets with draped in the American flag, and occasionally images of dead or wounded soldiers that were being cared for by other soldiers, but those were always photographed from a distance. And so this work kind of speaks to how we envision the deaths of American soldiers. We're not familiar with what war actually does to the human body. We only have in our mind this kind of beautiful death that Hollywood has served us. So this project, my study of the warrior hero archetype seems to have kind of come to a culmination in my monuments project. And this work started when I was traveling for the American Anthem project. I kept coming across these odd monuments, like this gravesite for Stonewall Jackson's arm, uh, that someone had left a rose on, and it's really out in the country. It's really off the beaten path. So somebody definitely, made pilgrimage to this site in order to place this rose on there. And there's like 8 different sites that Parks and Recreation uphold that are dedicated to Stonewall Jackson, which I always found really odd because Stonewall Jackson was shot by his own men. And it was very early in the war, but he did become they just kind of used him as this hero, as for for propaganda's sake. So
Right.
yeah. So, I started photographing them, and I didn't know what I was going to do with them or where they would lead me. As an artist, sometimes you just have these times where you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. hoping that the work will tell you at some point, it'll inform you why you're here and what you're doing. So yeah, so I did that. I also did another project after American Anthem where I documented prepper culture. And for the sake of time and focus, we're not gonna look at that work today, but you can see that on my website because it is connected. It's definitely connected to the archetype of the hero.
Yeah, Max did a prepper show. Wow, when I still lived in California, so prior to 2016, but after he got there, so in the early like 2010s, I think he.
Yeah, 2014, I was in that show. It was the
Oh, were
first
you?
time.
Okay,
Yeah, it was the first time
fantastic.
I showed that
Okay,
work.
great.
Yeah,
Okay, good.
yeah,
That
he
was
was the
that was
first
an
one to show it.
interesting show for our community.
Hmm.
I'm sure we really had a lot of exposure to that kind of a culture, so it was a great show.
Yeah, yeah, it was a great show. So this monument is on the site of a former World War II Japanese internment camp. The camp was built on a reservation, the Gila River Indian community in Arizona. It was built during the war out of scrap by the families of the young Japanese American men who fought and died for America in World War II. And so this was made by their grieving families and the community that was interned there. And so the monument is, the site's not open to the public. The Gila River Indian community maintains the site, and families come and visit the site, but nobody else. It took me a long time. It took me about 6 months to get access to and get the okay to come go there and photograph this monument. And they had a guide there for me, so I was very directed. I was only allowed to be in certain areas, and but it was really fascinating. And so this monument's never been photographed. I'm the first, other than by family members. So
And is that why they were so protective about? Okay.
yeah, they don't want people coming and visiting. They do not at all, and I understand why. I mean, first of all, they never even wanted the internment camp on their land. They were forced into that, and so it was made just started out that way. But the Indian community and the Japanese community came together, and so they maintain the site together, which is really beautiful. It's a
It is.
beautiful monument too, really gorgeous. And then the Confederate monuments started coming down, and then I knew. I was like, okay, that's why I'm here. That's what this project is all about. And so in 2017, I began focusing on documenting the monuments that were being removed. The photographs and the way I display them, they include captions that tell you, when it was constructed, who paid for it, when it was removed, and some relevant information from its history. So this is the removed Jefferson Davis Monument that's in New Orleans. And, in 2017, like right after Charlottesville, Mitch Landrieu, the mayor there, had all of the Confederate monuments in New Orleans removed. And he also wrote a book about it. It's called In the Shadow of Statues, A White Southerner Confronts History, which is a really wonderful book. I highly recommend it. I lived in New Orleans for several years in the 90s, and I lived just about 5 blocks away from this monument. It's in a very Black neighborhood and predominantly Black. And as you can see, it was created in the Jim Crow era, which is during the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights eras when the majority of Confederate monuments were created in this country. Today, there's still over 1,700 Confederate monuments or plaques or names of schools, names of streets still in the United States. And the majority were built by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And they're still at it. In 2017, they installed and dedicated a plaque to Jefferson Davis in San Diego, California. They view the, I know, they view
Yeah.
They just, it's incredible the way that they just kind of like anything that could connect a Confederate to some place in the country, they create this kind of history about it and then put up a plaque. And so the one in San Diego is based on the fact it's on the freeway. They call the 101 the Jefferson Davis Freeway highway because of some of the routes that were paved during the Civil War, and so they designated those as being the start of these highways, and so they give credit to him for that. So
That's a stretch, but okay.
it is a huge stretch.
That
It's
is
a
a stretch
huge.
because, yeah.
So the caption for this image was a little bit too long for the slide, so I'm going to read it. It says, the dedication event was a whites-only ceremony that included children dressed in red, white, and blue, creating a Confederate living battle flag and singing Dixie. The dedication date corresponds with the 50th anniversary of the inauguration of Jefferson Davis as President of the Confederate States of America.
I am shaking my head. When we lived in Montgomery, Alabama, it was very, very, it was the war of Northern aggression. And as you said earlier, they're still fighting it. It's a very, this is such a well-timed exhibition because we are really still, we lived there 20 years ago, but it's a conversation that is still being had, this sort of, we sort of in Boston particularly look at it and just sort of say sore losers, but at the end of the day, it is like the Revolutionary War to us, here in the Northeast particularly, but in the country in general. But
yeah,
that no one really likes to lose, and in a country that is far from being united, that dissent is still very, very loud.
absolutely, absolutely. And they made clear that, in the Reconstruction that they were going to redefine their role and redefine the role of the South in the war. And that's what they're continuing to do. So, most of these are on public property. This one is on the corner of Canal Street and Jefferson Davis, and so Canal Street is the main road, one of the biggest main roads in New Orleans that leads you into the quarter. So it very much defines like this is white space, and that's what they were designed to do. We see them and outside courthouses. Universities, in front of libraries, all in parks, public parks, in these spaces that they were, very particularly designating as white. So these are from the University of Texas in Austin, Texas. And so these monuments lined the South Mall, which is a large open area in the front of campus. It's like it's the entrance to the university, and the South Mall is where a lot of students hang out. It's close to the library. It's very beautiful. It has these beautiful oak trees, and so it's this kind of park-like setting. And so they lined that setting, and then at the end of that mall is the famous clock tower, where Charles Whitman killed 17 people in 1966 in a mass shooting. My father was on campus that day that happened, so it was very. We never thought that we would see as many as we do today. When I grew up learning about that one. But the students at UT pressured the president to remove these monuments, and they did. And so they were removed in 2017. The president wrote a very beautiful letter to the community. There's a link to it on my website, talking about how he decided to remove them and how, and talking about, that Confederate monuments have become symbols of modern white supremacy and neo-Nazism. And so I took these photographs like a year later, and they were still wrapped. Like, they took the statues off, but the plinths were still there and the plaques were still on them, and they didn't quite know what to do. So they just wrapped them up and hid them. And so they're starting to kind of decay a little bit, which is one of the things that I like about photographing these empty plinths, and this kind of relic of a world that hopefully has died or is dying off. And so makes me think of the possibilities of these spaces, and these how we can think about reconfiguring our public space. And now we have public committee meetings to decide what's going to go in those spaces, but back then they didn't.
Right.
So, yeah. And then while, Trump was in office, he signed an executive order to stop the removal of the monuments, because you notice it kind of got quiet there for a while. So his executive order says that protesters who damage or dismantle monuments will face 10 years in jail. And so, a lot of the monuments were already in, people were already fighting to have them removed. They were already in the process of deaccession, but that takes a very long time. And then that summer of 2020 just was such a hot point that they started being pulled down. So they're still being deassessed properly, but it kind of stopped what was happening during that time. Interesting thing is that now that the Capitol falls under the category of protected sites, that this executive order.
Oh my! Wow. Okay.
So yeah, so that executive order can be used to prosecute the insurrectionists.
Handy.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like I said, I'm hoping that what I'm hoping is that people who didn't get a chance, we mentioned, or I didn't actually mention at the very beginning, but there was a panel discussion at the Torrance Art Museum that discussed the several artists attended, and it discussed kind of that interplay. Again, I think one of the things that the TAM staff, and Max in particular, is excellent at doing is finding artists for the main gallery, which is our largest space, to really complement and play off of each other. And he curates the exhibitions in such a way that your eye moves. It goes from Sandow's piece to yours, and throughout the whole entire space.
Yeah.
And so what my goal is that people will listen to some of the talks that we have done before they go, so they can get a deeper understanding of Michelle Jacques. Is it Michelle Jacques? Yes, Michelle.
The flags, yeah.
The flags, everybody's work is so much, and this goes for any museum experience, but and far beyond the label. So if there were some way that what the artist was thinking and experienced to get to those images is imbued somehow on us as we were looking at them, some sort of, I'm not really even sure how it would work, but it's really helpful, I think, to be able to stand in front of a piece and absorb much more than what the label says.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the exhibition kind of opens up the conversation. And and Max is so good at that, of creating these shows that open up a really powerful conversation that needs to be had.
Right.
And it's inviting for people. It doesn't put people off. It really engages the public. And so, we had such a wonderful time at the talk, and there were a lot of people there, and they were very had a lot of questions and became part of the conversation. It was really exciting.
Good, good. I'm glad to hear that went well. I'm hoping that as the TAM gets more staff and hopefully more hours and more funding, that they'll be able to do more of that, more community engagement. We get a lot of folks coming in from LA and the surrounds when we have openings, but when we have panel discussions, we find oftentimes there's a lot of local people that will come in too. So I think that those conversations are worth having, particularly now in Torrance. The reenactments are an interesting topic to cover.
Thank you. Yes.
And particularly, so I had a couple of questions before we go, and I can, I'll ask them really quickly. You had mentioned at the very beginning about the Matthew Brady, is it Brady tableau?
Yes, the Matthew Brady images. Yeah.
Yes, and the Lost Cause, which I think was UDC.
Mm-hmm.
So the Matthew Brady tableau, can you explain a little bit about what that was or what the studio was?
So, like that Harvest of Death photo, which is really famous photo of Gettysburg, probably the most famous image from that war. And it's the one that you see in your history books. It was, it's the one that was, forefront in documentaries and things like that. And so the reenactments are staged, and there's very specific, they have seats for you, and so everything is very performative, and so there's a very precise location for the viewer to sit. And then so they do the battle, and then they kind of pop into these images, like I'll go back to the one I'm talking about. So like this one, so you can see the bodies being laid out, and of course that's not exact, but they bring in the horse. There's the guy on the horse right here, or there's the guy on the horse right here. You have this kind of sloping background, and they're recreating these images. And which is a very kind of like, there's a whole group that does what we call tableau vivants, where they reenact a painting, like a living painting.
Yes.
So it's kind of coming off of that.
Okay. Yeah, like Pageant of the Masters, I think.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
okay.
exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking about when I saw this.
Right.
I was like, oh my God, they're doing Pageant of the Masters, but with Matthew Brady photos. How weird.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit eerie. But were you saying, and maybe I misheard, but were you saying that even in the originals, they were staging actual, really?
Yes. Yes. And so
that's perhaps what's most disturbing. I mean, the reenactments are the reenactments, and I think that the people that do them, your description of the people who you interviewed afterward really sums up the fact that you don't see a lot of veterans or any veterans. I mean, we look at war in a very, very different way. But I think what's more disturbing to me is the desecration in the original photograph.
Well, they were artists, they were photographers, they wanted to create a good shot. So
wow.
They moved things around so that they would have a good shot. And so there's a few that we know of because we can see the body that had been moved. There's I'm blanking on the name of it, but there's a very famous image of a sharpshooter, a dead sharpshooter behind a rock. And his gun is there, and he's there. But then when you look at images that were taken, during that same photo shoot, because they have all of those images, then you see that same body and you see that same gun lying someplace else. So they pulled him into, I think it's called the sharpshooter's den, and they pulled him into this area and set up that shot. And so that opens it up to, well, how can we believe any of these as being, truthful? But like I said, photojournalism didn't exist. This is the beginning of photography. This is the first war aftermath that had ever been photographed. They didn't think about, needing it to be true for, we didn't even have, we didn't have photographs in newspapers until 1909. So, they were creating anti-war propaganda. They were specifically making work that was meant to be seen and shown as anti-war.
Wow. And the lost cause,
Mm-hmm.
when you referred to that, with the Daughters of the Confederacy,
Yeah.
what is that?
Well, so the lost cause narrative is basically their version of history that that where they focus on, the when you go, there's lots of besides the reenactments, there's different tents. You heard in the video that there's a medical reenactment. There's a, they'll have history talks, and so they'll have the reenactors, and they will be giving talks, and so they will be very specifically giving talks that don't discuss slavery at all,
Mm-hmm.
that talk about, states' rights, and that they created this narrative, the lost cause narrative, that's their version of the war that exonerates them, and that it was shameful what they did. And so I think that shame was so difficult, they couldn't face it. They created this narrative that made them the good guys also. And so that, oh, this is just civil war, it happens, and so it was about states' rights, it was about the economy, it was about all of these things. And
except for what it was really about. Sure.
exactly, it's like the states' rights to do what? To
Right.
own other people.
Right.
Let's
Right.
talk about what rights you're talking
Right.
about. Absolutely. I grew up in the South, so I was taught the lost cause narrative. It took me a while to, understand and what really happened, and to come to terms with that. And but it's important, like Mitch Landau says, that we have to face our terrible histories, and we do, and it's important, and it's not, we shouldn't, we don't need to feel shame about it anymore. Our ancestors should have felt more shame. But it's time for us to really be honest about what happened, and that's fine.
Right.
When I was in Europe a few years ago, and everybody's like, "Oh my God, how are you guys doing? We're so worried about you." And when somebody said, they nailed it. They said, "Oh, the United States, you're just a teenager. When you're old like us, then, you'll figure it out." Because it was, when I was over there, everything was so much more relaxed. And I realized how anxious we are in America. And I was like, that is such a good point. We really are, in the grand scheme of things, as a nation, we're in our teenage years.
Right. No, you're
Rebellious and angry, and looking at the truth and not liking what we see, but we have to come to terms with that.
right. And I think the shame comes in the inaction. So when you start to see,
Right.
Name changes of sports teams, I recognize that it comes with a great deal of, pushback. But when you start to see things like that, and you start to hear land declarations before many webinars and things like that, I think that those kinds of things are a step in the right direction, and that they will become so much more normalized that for future generations, it will just become a normal thing.
Yes.
And we will stop using names that are disrespectful for national pastimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I thank you so much for joining me today. As I mentioned, this recording will appear on our website and our social, on our Facebook, and hopefully the TAM staff will share it as well. The UnCivil War and Election Special. I feel like Max should have a second panel discussion now that the midterms are almost over. We're still waiting on a couple of We're still waiting, I think, on Arizona, but or Nevada. Maybe we're waiting on Nevada.
Yeah.
So this will be up along with exhibitions in Gallery 2 until the 10th of December when it closes. And so I would encourage folks to get out and take a look and spend some time. I think it's open today. I'm not sure with the holiday if they're open today or not. Again, I'm geographically at a disadvantage, but they will be open on Tuesday. So definitely come in and take a look and see. And I thank you, Allison, so much for spending your time this morning with me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I
All
enjoyed
right.
it.